How do I go there? All right. This Bible study brings together two of my favorite subjects. Colossians chapter 3, of course, because I really can't develop Bible lessons without periodically revisiting that chapter's put off and put on behaviors. And the book of Esther, who doesn't love that story with its monstrous villain and beautiful, faithful heroine who rescues her people from annihilation. I'm sure you each remember Esther's iconic statement, "Fast for me, I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go in to the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." That's in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. In my opinion, that assertion is matched only by that of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. That's in Daniel 4, verse 17 to 18. But Esther is not the character in the story on whom I want to focus. It's the comparison between Mordecai and Haman that fascinates me. Both men were employed by King Ahasuerus, but they demonstrate two completely different work ethics. Jesus' Beatitudes versus today's worldview. Beatitude number 1. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The world says, "Happy are the proud in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Beatitude number 2. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." The world says, "Happy are those who party, for they shall feel great about themselves." Beatitude number 3. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The world says, "Happy are the meek, for they may inherit something, but only if the alpha dogs let them in." Beatitude number 4. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." The world says, "Happy are those who hunger and thirst for power and wealth, for they shall be satisfied." Beatitude number 5, Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." The world says, "Happy are the unmerciful, for they shall climb to the top without feelings of guilt." Beatitude number 6, Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." The world says, "Happy are the heartless, for they shall obtain worldly success." Beatitude number 7, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." The world says, "Happy are the warmongers, for they shall become presidents." Just a Trump track. Yeah, very applicable to South Africa too, Deb. Beatitude number 8. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The world says, "Happy are those who persecute others for the sake of getting ahead, for theirs is the kingdom of this world." Beatitude number 9. Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The world says, "Happy are those on whom men cast insults and persecute and say all kinds of evil about them, for they shall be able to retaliate in tweets and seek revenge without any blame for having started the conflict." Therefore, this study will apply Colossians 3 to a study of Haman, pride, versus the spirit of Mordecai. So first, let's review Colossians 3, phrasing it as a vow. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 to 2 and verse 5. I will set my heart on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. I will set my mind on things above, not on earthly things. I will put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to my earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Colossians chapter 3, verse 7 to 10. I used to walk in these ways in the life I once lived, but now I promise to also rid myself of all such things as these: anger and rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from my lips. I will not lie to others, since I have taken off my old self with its practices and have put on the new self. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 to 13. Therefore, as one of God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, I will clothe myself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I will bear with others and forgive others if I have a grievance against anyone. I will forgive as the Lord has forgiven me. Colossians 3, verse 14 to 15 and 17. And over all these virtues I promise to put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. I will let the peace of Christ rule in my heart, since as members of one body we are all called to peace. And I promise to be thankful. And whatsoever I do, whether in word or deed, I promise to do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Colossians chapter 3 lists 10 behaviors to put off. Number 1, sexual immorality. 2, impurity. Then lust, evil desires, greed, which is idolatry, anger and rage, malice, slander, filthy language, and lying. Conversely, the same passage lists 10 behaviors to put on: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiveness, love, peacefulness, and thankfulness. Now let's look at our story while watching for evidence of the put off and put on behaviors in Colossians chapter 3. Starting in the second chapter after Queen Vashti's banishment. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about, when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa, into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. What have we seen thus far? Mordecai, compassion, kindness, love. Continuing the story. The king loved Esther more than all the women, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it is written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. That's Esther chapter 2, verse 17, 21 to 23. Sitting at the king's gate. Let's look at what that means in other Bible passages. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat there, and behold, a close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. People who sat in the gate had official business to conduct. This is the story about when Boaz makes a formal request to be allowed to redeem Naomi's land and to marry Ruth. Additional references. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate at Sodom. That's in Genesis 19. And if you follow Lot's story, you will find that first he moved towards Sodom, Genesis 13:12. Then he moved into Sodom, Genesis 14:12. And then he sat in authority in the gate of Sodom. And as Leilani pointed out in a lesson in Daniel, then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king, possibly serving as a mediator for his people. That's in Daniel 2, verse 49. Therefore, sitting at the gate puts Mordecai into a position of authority, making him an employee of the king. Continuing the story. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was, when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. That's in Esther chapter 3. Now what behaviors have we seen? Haman, an Agagite, anger and wrath, malice, evil desire. Mordecai, a Jew, meekness towards God, and humility. Now we see that both Mordecai and Haman worked for Ahasuerus, king of Persia. So let's look at the Agagites versus the Jews. There's a backstory to Haman's animosity. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 1 to 3, verse 20 and 32 to 33. Then Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on the mission on which the Lord had sent me, and I have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully, and Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made many women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king that Samuel had killed. It would seem then that Haman had a personal reason for wanting to destroy all the Jews in Persia. Continuing, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put into the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. That's in Esther 3, verse 7 to 12. So let's look at the behaviors. Haman, slander, impurity regarding a bribe, and malice. We need to unpack this passage though. Let's start with the signet ring. You know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Then the men approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days, is to be cast into the lion's den?" The king replied, "The statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." That's in Daniel 6, verse 12. In Persia, once a king sealed a decree using his signet ring on hot wax, the law could not be changed, not even by the king himself. Therefore, once King Ahasuerus allowed Haman to seal the decree regarding the Jews, it became an unbreakable law. Now let's consider the importance of the 13th day of the first month. In Leviticus 23, verse 4 to 5, we read, "These are the appointed times of the Lord, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, is the Lord's Passover." As Sister Liana has pointed out, every detail in the Bible is important. Note then that as this decree was being sealed, the Jews were approaching the days of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Spoiler alert. Mordecai is representative of a Christ-like figure who sets into motion a plan by which death will pass over his people. So continuing the story. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. That's in Esther 4, verse 1 to 3 and verse 5. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who comes into the king to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he may live. I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. And that's Esther 4, verse 7 to 12. So now we read of Esther's brave commitment to her people. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. And that's in Esther 4, verse 13 to 17. For such a time as this. Esther's acceptance of this challenge tells us a lot about her, but additionally, Mordecai's words say a lot about his own faith also. So what behaviors do we recognize from Colossians 3? Mordecai encourages Esther towards compassion, humility, bearing with one another, and love. Remember, the king allows Esther to approach him, and she invites both the king and Mordecai to dinner twice. Let's focus in on Haman following the first dinner. Then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, even Esther the queen let no one but me to come to the king to the banquet, which she had prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her with the king. Yet all this does not satisfy me. Every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate, Esther chapter 5, verse 9 to 13. For all that is in the world is not from the Father, but is from the world. 1 John 2, verse 16, and Esther 5, verse 9 to 13. 1 John 2, the lust of the flesh, compared to Esther Haman's enjoyment of the banquet. 1 John 2, the lust of the eyes, the glory of Haman's riches in Esther 5. 1 John 2, the boastful pride of life. And Esther 5, verse 9 to 13, Haman's being magnified and promoted in the king's court. Compare Haman's wife and friends with King Ahab's Queen Jezebel regarding Naboth. So here we're going to compare Esther 5, verse 14 to 1 Kings 21, verse 7 and 9 to 10. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And their advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. In 1 Kings 2, Jezebel, his wife, said to Ahab, do you now reign over Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be joyful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Now she wrote in the letter, saying, proclaim a fast, and seat Naboth at the head of the table, and seat 2 worthless men before him, and let them testify against him, saying, you cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. So now we observe Haman, anger and wrath, greed, malice, evil desire. Beware. Very beware. Chapter 6 of Esther is my favorite part of the study. So now wake up and pay attention. During that time, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records before the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing's been done for him." So the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." Esther chapter 6. So Haman's plan for Mordecai. Let's compare Matthew 27, verse 22 to 23. Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." But the irony is stunning. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for a man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback throughout the city square, and proclaim before them, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said." That's in Esther 6. So the king's plan for Mordecai. Compare Matthew 21, verse 1 to 9. Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me." The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them. Most of the crowd spread their coats in the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them in the road. The crowds going ahead of him and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaiming before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." Don't you love it? Yeah.
Amen.
Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Note Mordecai's reaction. He goes back to work after all this excitement. And Haman hurries home, mourning with his head covered. Haman recounts to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So drum roll, please. Thank you. Compare Matthew 20, verse 16. "Thus the last shall be first, and the first last." Amazing. Again, considering Colossians chapter 3. Haman, malice, evil desire, and greed, compared to Mordecai, humility. Would someone please read Romans chapter 8, verse 5 to 14? Do we have a volunteer? Okay, Liesl says she'll read.
If someone else wants to read.
Is someone else wanting to read? Otherwise, Liesl's happy to read.
Still turning pages.
Romans 8, verse 5 to 14.
Okay, I've got it. This is Carol.
Okay, Carol, thank you.
So then, they that are in the flesh cannot please God. But ye are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. And if Christ be in you, the body, in you. The body is dead because of sin, but the spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the spirit of him that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also give life to your mortal bodies by his spirit that dwells in you. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live after the flesh. For if we live after the flesh, we shall die. But if ye therefore, but if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. I had to add that one. It just means so much to me.
That's very nice. Thank you, Carol. So let's rephrase parts of that passage. Haman worked according to the put-offs, and so he set his mind on the things of the flesh. But Mordecai served according to the put-ons, and so he set his mind on the things of the spirit. For the mind working according to the flesh is death, but the mind set on the spirit is life and peace. Haman's mind was hostile to God. He did not work according to the law of God, for he was so selfish that he was unable to be focused on anyone else but himself. However, Mordecai did not serve according to the flesh, but in an other-centered spirit, because the selfless Spirit of God dwelled in him. For all who serve by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. So let's continue with our story. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite, and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows, because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. That's in Esther 8, verse 1 to 2 and 7 to 8. So how can Mordecai cancel out Haman's edict, given that it was sealed with the king's signet ring? He can't. Instead, he issues a counter decree allowing the Jews the right to assemble and to defend their lives and to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. That's in Esther 8, verse 11. So once again, we see the conflicting laws of God and of sin. Haman's law, all Jews to be killed, men, women, and children, on the 13th day of Adar. Mordecai's law, all Jews, men, women, and children, allowed to arm and defend themselves against the attack on the 13th day of Adar. So Romans 7, verse 14 to 25. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man. But I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself, with my mind, am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. And then we have the happy ending. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor in each and every province and in each and every city. Wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai became greater and greater. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. That's in Esther 8, verse 15 to 17, 9, verse 4, and 10, verse 3. Additionally, all 10 sons of Haman were killed at Susa, thereby completing the destruction of Agag's household. Instructions given to King Saul by